The road stretched ahead, empty and silent, swallowed by the endless night. Trees lined both sides, their skeletal branches reaching out like clawed fingers against the dim glow of the moon. The wind whispered through the leaves, carrying with it an unsettling stillness that clung to the air like a warning. Ethan Grayson tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening as his headlights sliced through the darkness. His body was tense, his thoughts clouded with exhaustion. He had been driving for hours, trying to put as much distance between himself and the life he was leaving behind. A fresh start. That's what he needed. The small town of Black Hollow was his destination, a place he had only read about online. Isolated, quiet, and seemingly untouched by the chaos of the outside world. He had rented an old house on the outskirts, just beyond the dense forest that locals called the Whispering Pines. A fitting name, he thought, given the way the trees seemed to murmur secrets to the wind. His phone had lost signal miles ago, and the radio was nothing but static. With a sigh, Ethan reached for his coffee cup, only to curse under his breath when he realized it was empty. He'd have to stop soon. That was when he saw it. A figure standing on the side of the road. A lone silhouette against the abyss. His heart jolted as his foot instinctively pressed the brake. The figure stood motionless, bathed in the pale glow of his headlights. It was tall, unnaturally so. Its limbs were elongated, its head tilted slightly as if studying him. Ethan swallowed hard. He knew stopping for a stranger in the middle of nowhere was a bad idea. He had seen enough horror movies to understand how this story could end. But as he slowly drove past, something compelled him to take a second glance. The figure was gone. His breath hitched. He hadn't seen it move. It had just vanished. A cold chill crawled down his spine, and suddenly, the air in the car felt suffocating. He shook his head, gripping the wheel tighter. "You're just tired," he told himself. "Seeing things." But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The house in the woods. By the time Ethan reached the house, a dense fog had rolled in, swallowing the landscape in a thick, ghostly haze. The property was exactly as described, a rustic cabin-style house with chipped paint and a warped wooden porch. It stood alone at the edge of the forest, shrouded in an eerie silence. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to shake off the unease from the road. This was home now. After unloading his bags, he stepped inside. The interior was old but well-kept, wooden floors that creaked under his weight, walls lined with dusty bookshelves, and a stone fireplace that gave the space a strange sense of warmth despite the chill lingering in the air. As he walked further in, something odd caught his attention. A mirror. It was an antique, standing tall in the hallway, its frame carved with intricate symbols that looked ancient. Ethan frowned, stepping closer. The glass was smudged and warped, making his reflection look distorted. Then he saw movement. Not his own. Something shifted behind him in the reflection. Ethan spun around, heart hammering. Nothing. He let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. "Just my mind playing tricks on me," he assured himself. It's been a long drive. But as he turned to walk away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Something inside the mirror. The first night. Exhaustion weighed heavy on his body, but sleep did not come easy. The wind outside howled through the trees, rattling the windows. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, shifting with every flicker of the dying fireplace. Ethan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Tick, tick, tick. Then, silence. The ticking stopped. His breath hitched. The air in the room felt heavier, thick with an unseen presence. He turned his head toward the doorway, his pulse quickening. A shadow stood there. At first, he thought it was just another trick of the dim light. But as his eyes adjusted, the shadow moved. It was watching him. Ethan sat up abruptly, his skin crawling with dread. He fumbled for the bedside lamp, but before he could reach it, the door creaked open. The shadow slipped inside. A suffocating cold filled the room. Ethan felt his limbs freeze, his breath coming in ragged gasps as an unseen force seemed to press against his chest. A whisper slithered through the air. "You shouldn't have come." Then, the room plunged into darkness. The mark of the entity. Ethan woke up gasping. His body was drenched in cold sweat, his heart pounding violently against his ribs. The first rays of morning light seeped through the curtains, casting long streaks of gold across the wooden floor. Had it been a nightmare? His mind screamed that it was, but his body knew otherwise. There was an aching pressure in his chest, as if something had been sitting on him. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake the lingering dread. Then he noticed it. A mark. On his forearm, just below his wrist, a strange symbol had been burned into his skin. It wasn't a bruise or a cut, it was something else. Something unnatural. His stomach churned. This wasn't a dream. Something had touched him. And it wasn't done with him yet. To be continued. The morning air was crisp, yet Ethan couldn't shake the icy dread clinging to his skin. The strange mark on his forearm felt like it pulsed with an unnatural energy, a burning reminder of the thing that had entered his room the night before. He traced the symbol with his fingers. The shape was intricate, almost ritualistic. A twisting, spiraling form that seemed to shift if he looked at it too long. His mind reeled with questions. Had he somehow done this to himself? A bizarre sleepwalking episode? He had never suffered from that before, but what other explanation was there? He needed answers. The library's secrets. Black Hollow was a small town, barely more than a collection of buildings huddled together against the vastness of the surrounding forest. It had the essentials: a diner, a gas station, and, most importantly, a library. The librarian, an elderly woman named Ms. Holloway, eyed him curiously when he entered. "You're the one who moved into the old house by the woods," she murmured, more a statement than a question. Ethan hesitated. "Yeah, why?" She regarded him carefully, her wrinkled fingers tracing the edge of a book she had been reading. "No one's lived there for years." "Not since." She cut herself off and gave a small shake of her head. "Never mind. What can I help you with?" He debated pressing her for more information but decided against it. Instead, he asked for books on local folklore, haunted places, and, though he felt ridiculous saying it, occult symbols. Ms. Holloway's expression darkened, but she retrieved a small pile of dusty books without a word. Ethan found a secluded table and started flipping through the pages. Most of it was generic ghost stories, campfire legends meant to scare children. But then something caught his eye. A passage about an entity. Not a ghost. Not a demon. Something else entirely. There exists a shadow that does not belong to this world. It is neither living nor dead, but something in between, a force that lingers in darkness, drawn to those who dare to disturb its resting place. It marks its chosen, binding them to its presence. Once touched, escape is impossible. Ethan's breath hitched as he glanced down at the mark on his arm. A feeling of suffocating dread coiled in his stomach. Had he disturbed something? Unseen eyes in the dark. The drive back to the house felt longer than before. The trees loomed higher, the shadows stretched further. The road seemed to close in around him, as if the forest itself had drawn closer. He turned up the radio, hoping for some distraction, but the static was worse than before, louder, filled with strange, broken whispers. He turned it off. When he finally reached the house, he hesitated before stepping inside. It felt different now. The air was heavy, thick with something unseen. As he walked through the hallway, he caught movement in the corner of his eye. His gaze snapped to the antique mirror. The reflection was wrong. His room was behind him in the mirror's image, just as it should be. But there, in the farthest corner of the reflection, stood a figure. Motionless. Watching. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He spun around. Nothing. But when he turned back to the mirror, the figure was closer. A shiver of pure terror ran down his spine. He couldn't move. He couldn't look away. The shadow in the reflection lifted its hand. Ethan's fingers twitched involuntarily, his own hand mirroring the movement. Not mirroring. Being controlled. A cold, invisible force wrapped around his wrist, jerking his arm up against his will. He struggled, his breath coming in panicked gasps as his own reflection smiled at him. The thing inside the mirror wasn't just mimicking him. It was trying to take his place. With every ounce of willpower, Ethan ripped his gaze away and stumbled backward, crashing into the bookshelf. The moment his eyes left the glass, the force vanished. Panting, he looked back at the mirror. His reflection was normal again. No shadow. No unnatural movements. But the mark on his arm burned. And he knew deep in his bones that it was still there. Watching. Waiting. The night takes hold. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat in bed, clutching the pocket knife he kept in the nightstand. The house was silent, but not peacefully so. It was the kind of silence that listened. Every so often he would hear a creak, a soft shuffle, the distant sound of breathing, not his own. Midnight came. Then the whispers started. Low, rasping voices slithered through the darkness, speaking words he didn't understand. The air turned frigid, his breath visible in the dim glow of the bedside lamp. Then, the scratching. A slow, deliberate scraping sound against the wood of his bedroom door. Ethan's grip tightened around the knife. His pulse pounded in his ears. He had two choices. Stay in the room, paralyzed with fear, or face whatever was on the other side. With a deep breath he stood. The scratching stopped. His hand hovered over the doorknob. His fingers trembled. Then, in the silence, a voice whispered directly behind him. "You are already mine." The breath on his neck was ice cold. Ethan spun, swinging the knife wildly. Nothing was there. The room was empty. But the mirror was fogged over, as if something had just breathed on it from the inside. And written in the condensation were two words. No escape. The words on the mirror had long since faded, but their presence remained seared into Ethan's mind. No escape. He hadn't left the house all day. He barely moved. The events of the previous night had shattered any illusion of safety. Whatever was haunting him wasn't just lingering in the corners of his vision anymore. It was inside his home, inside his reflection, inside his very mind. He sat in the dimly lit living room, gripping a mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The silence in the house felt unnatural, as if the walls were holding their breath. Outside, the fog had thickened, clinging to the windows like an oppressive veil. Then, something new happened. The phone rang. Ethan flinched so violently that he nearly dropped his mug. The landline sat on the nearby table, covered in dust. He hadn't even considered using it since he arrived. The signal on his cell phone was still dead. The phone rang again. Something deep inside him screamed, "Don't answer it." But his hand moved before he could stop himself. He lifted the receiver, bringing it to his ear with hesitant, shaking fingers. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a whisper. "You let it in." Ethan's blood turned to ice. The voice was distorted, layered, as if multiple people were speaking at once. But beneath the static, he recognized something familiar. It was his own voice. His breath came in ragged gasps. "Who is this?" he demanded. A soft chuckle. A sickening, wet sound. "You already know." The line went dead. Ethan dropped the phone as though it had burned him. His chest heaved, panic rising like bile in his throat. The words echoed in his skull. "You let it in." The mirror's secret. That night, sleep was a distant hope. The entity wasn't hiding anymore. It was growing bolder. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. The air was thick with whispers. The walls themselves seemed to pulse, as though the house was breathing in unison with something unseen. Ethan tried to ignore it. He barricaded his bedroom door, kept the lights on, and sat with his back against the wall, knife in hand. But at exactly midnight, the lights flickered. Then the mirror called to him. Not with sound, not with movement, but with an undeniable, overwhelming pull. Ethan fought it, but his body felt sluggish, as if something else were guiding him. He rose to his feet, barely aware of his own actions, and turned toward the antique mirror in the hallway. The reflection inside was wrong. At first glance, it was just him. But the longer he stared, the more he saw the differences. His reflection was grinning. Wide, unnatural, a grotesque stretch of lips that didn't belong to him. And then, in the reflection, something moved behind him. His real body was frozen in place, but his reflection turned its head, slowly, unnaturally, toward the dark hallway behind him. Ethan wanted to turn. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to look. But something told him that if he did, if he acknowledged whatever was there, he would never be the same again. Instead, he closed his eyes. The whispers surged, furious, clawing at his mind. Then the glass shattered. Something is taking over. Ethan woke up on the floor, his head pounding. Shards of the mirror lay scattered around him. But the worst part? The mark on his arm had spread. The once small, intricate symbol had grown, curling up toward his elbow like creeping veins of ink. And this time it moved. Not like a trick of the light. It slithered, shifting beneath his skin as if something inside him was trying to crawl out. Panic seized his chest. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen, his hands shaking violently, and pressed the blade against his arm. If this was part of the entity, he had to get it out. But the moment the steel touched his skin, something whispered inside his head. "That won't help you, Ethan." He dropped the knife with a sharp gasp, stumbling backward. His vision swam. The voice wasn't external this time, it was inside him. And worse, it was starting to sound like his own thoughts. The hunter and the hunted. Ethan had always been a rational man. He didn't believe in ghosts, demons, or cursed houses. But logic had no place here anymore. The entity wasn't just haunting him, it was trying to become him. He paced the house, his mind racing for a plan. He had read something in one of the books at the library, something about severing the connection. He had to go back, had to find out what was happening before it was too late. Grabbing his jacket, he made his way to the door. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Not his own. They came from the hallway, slow and deliberate. Something was walking toward him. His pulse pounded in his ears. The air felt thick, suffocating. He took a step back. The footsteps quickened. Then he saw it. A shadow detached itself from the wall and began moving toward him. Not creeping, not slithering, striding. Ethan turned and ran. The house stretched unnaturally as he moved. The door that should have been a few feet away now seemed miles from reach. The walls pulsed, breathing, closing in around him. And the footsteps were right behind him. He reached the door just as cold fingers brushed the back of his neck. He didn't stop. Didn't look back. He tore through the night, sprinting toward his car as the shadows chased him. The moment he reached the vehicle, he threw himself inside and locked the doors. His breath came in ragged, panicked gasps as he jammed the key into the ignition. For a moment, nothing happened. The headlights flickered to life. And standing directly in front of the car, illuminated in the beams, was himself. His own reflection. It stared at him, head tilted at an unnatural angle. And then slowly it grinned. Ethan screamed. Ethan's hands were slick with sweat as they gripped the steering wheel. His chest heaved, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he stared through the windshield at the impossible sight before him. Himself. A perfect replica. Same disheveled clothes, same haunted expression, except for the twisted, grinning mouth. The figure's lips stretched too wide, curling at the edges like something that had forgotten how to mimic human emotion. Its eyes, dark and empty, bore into him, flickering with something hungry. Then it moved. Slow. Deliberate. One step forward. Then another. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. His body screamed at him to move, but his limbs felt like they were filled with cement. The reflection raised a hand, fingers blackened, curling like talons, and pressed its palm against the hood of the car. The engine groaned, the metal shuddering as an unnatural cold seeped through the vehicle. Then, the thing's lips parted. It didn't speak. It just left. A warped, guttural noise that clawed at Ethan's sanity. That broke the paralysis. With a strangled gasp, he slammed the car into reverse, tires screeching against the pavement as he backed away from the abomination. The figure didn't react. It simply stood there, watching. But as Ethan turned the wheel and sped away into the night, he made the mistake of glancing in the rearview mirror. The reflection was still there. Sitting in the back seat. Ethan's scream tore through the car as he swerved wildly, nearly sending himself off the road. The presence in the mirror grinned wider, whispering something he couldn't understand, low, guttural syllables that slithered through his ears like a parasite burrowing into his mind. He didn't dare look again. He just drove. Away from the house. Away from the thing that had taken his face. But deep inside, he knew. He wasn't running from it. It was coming with him. The Book of Shadows. Ethan reached the library in record time, skidding to a stop outside the darkened building. The old wooden doors loomed before him, and for a terrifying moment, he wondered if they would be locked. He couldn't afford to be locked out. His fingers fumbled with the handle, then, mercifully, the door creaked open. He slipped inside, shutting it behind him and pressing his back against the wood. Silence. But not safety. Never safety. The air inside the library was thick, the shadows stretching unnaturally in the dim glow of the emergency lights. Books lined the shelves like silent sentinels, their pages whispering secrets he couldn't hear. He didn't have time to question the impossibility of the open door. He needed to find that book, the one that spoke of the entity. His feet carried him toward the occult section, heart hammering against his ribs. The library felt wrong tonight, distorted, the aisles longer than they should have been, the shelves taller, pressing in on him. And then, a voice. Familiar. You won't find what you're looking for. Ethan froze. The voice hadn't come from behind him. It had come from the reflection in the glass case beside him. His own face stared back at him from the dusty glass, but it wasn't a perfect match. His reflection's eyes were too dark. The pupils too large. The skin too pale. And that smile. It was stretching. Widening. Ethan took a step back. His reflection didn't. Instead, it pressed both hands against the glass, its grin splitting its face like a wound. You're looking in the wrong place, Ethan. The lights flickered. The glass shattered. The truth in the pages. Ethan stumbled backward, heart slamming against his ribs as shards of glass rained onto the floor. His breathing was ragged, his pulse a deafening roar in his ears. Then he saw it. The book. Lying on the floor amidst the broken glass, its aged leather cover cracked and faded. The exact book he had been searching for. His hands trembled as he reached for it, flipping the pages frantically. His eyes darted over the text, desperate for something, anything, that could tell him how to stop this nightmare. Then he found it. The hollow reflection is not a mere spirit, nor a demon of old. It is a parasite of the self, an entity that feeds on the image of those it marks. Once it takes form, it will seek to replace its host. Ethan's blood ran cold. It begins as a shadow, then takes the voice, the reflection, and, finally, the body. His stomach twisted violently. The mark on his arm. The voice on the phone. The thing in the mirror. It wasn't just haunting him. It was trying to become him. His fingers tightened around the book as he read the final line on the page. If the ritual is not severed in time, the original will be erased. Forever. A sharp, scraping sound echoed through the aisles. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Something was walking toward him. The final warning. He didn't have time to think. He grabbed the book and ran, weaving through the labyrinth of shelves as the footsteps followed. Faster. He didn't dare look back. He could hear it moving, could feel the air grow colder with each step. The exit was in sight, just a few more feet. Then the lights went out. Complete, suffocating darkness. Ethan skidded to a halt, chest rising and falling in panicked gasps. The voice. Right beside his ear. There is no escape, Ethan. A hand closed around his wrist. Cold. Wrong. Not human. Ethan screamed. Blackness. Ethan's world was reduced to a single point of pain and darkness. His vision was clouded with blackness, his body immobilized as if held by invisible chains. The grip on his wrist tightened, its icy touch digging into his skin, and for a moment he thought he might lose his mind entirely. Then, something snapped. The darkness began to recede, pulling away from him in jagged fragments, revealing a blurry figure in front of him. At first, it was just a silhouette, but then he saw it clearly, himself. Not just any reflection. Not any mere duplicate. This was a thing that had become him. Its grin was still wide, too wide, stretching across its face like a diseased wound. The eyes were dark, empty voids that swallowed everything around them. And worse still, it moved, mirroring every twitch of Ethan's body, every subtle shift in his breath. It wasn't just copying him. It was trying to claim him. You're too late, the thing whispered, its voice like gravel scraping over glass, the sound vibrating within his bones. Ethan struggled against the grip on his wrist, but it held him in place, its fingers like icy steel. The book was still clutched in his other hand, its pages threatening to slip away as if the knowledge it held was turning to dust. "You won't win," the reflection continued, leaning closer, its lips brushing against Ethan's ear. "I am already inside. You cannot escape yourself." The last of the book's pages fluttered open as if guided by some invisible force. Ethan's mind raced. The ritual. He had to finish the ritual. But what if it was too late? The book warned him. If he failed now, the entity would replace him forever. The original would be erased, left as nothing more than an echo, a shadow. The grip on his wrist tightened until his bones creaked, but Ethan pushed back against the growing wave of despair. He had come too far to let it end like this. He had to sever the connection. With every ounce of strength he had left, he reached for the last part of the book. The words were fuzzy at first. The pages blurred and shifted beneath his trembling fingers, the ink seeming to melt before his eyes. But then, clarity. There was a chant. A final incantation. The voice inside his mind demanded he stop. The reflection laughed, low, guttural, its voice growing stronger, more demanding, more certain. But Ethan, through the storm of terror and doubt, forced himself to speak the words. The chant spilled from his lips, almost unintelligible, a broken rhythm of sound that filled the air with a strange energy. The moment the final syllable left his mouth, he felt the coldness lift, like a weight being dragged off his chest. And then, everything went silent. For a long, terrifying moment, nothing moved. The darkness that had surrounded him seemed to retreat into the corners, leaving only the soft, steady beat of his own heart. Then he felt the presence again. But this time, it was different. The grip on his wrist loosened. He glanced down, and where it had been, there was now nothing. The coldness, the shadows, the reflection, it was all gone. He stumbled back, dizzy, disoriented, barely able to breathe. His pulse thundered in his ears. Was it over? And then, the shifting of air. A whisper brushed past him. "It's not over, Ethan." The reflection stood there, behind him, its features flickering like a dying light. The grin still stretched, but this time, it was fading. It was fading because Ethan had taken it back. The ritual had worked. The entity had been forced to release its hold, to return to the shadows where it had come from. It had been banished, but not without a price. Ethan turned, facing the fading figure. He felt the weight lift from his chest, but the memory of the entity's presence would haunt him forever. Its echo lingered in his mind, like a warning. He would never truly be free. But for now, the mirror was clear. The shadows had retreated. Ethan was himself again. Epilogue. The shadow lingers. Weeks passed. The sun rose and set, the world spun on in its endless march. Ethan found a new apartment far from the house, far from the place where it had all started. He went to work. He smiled at his friends. He lived, if only by force of will. But the nights were the hardest. The dreams still came. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart racing as he sat upright in bed, gasping for air. The reflection was there, in the corner of the room, always watching, always smiling that smile that was not his own. And sometimes, when he passed a mirror, just for a split second, a fleeting instant, he thought he saw it again. The entity, standing just behind him, grinning, in his reflection, just waiting for the moment when he would slip again. Because it was always there. And it was patient. The thing that had once been his shadow was now a part of him, a twisted reflection that would follow him for the rest of his life. And the worst part? It was never gone. It was always just beneath the surface,